During our divorce hearing, my wife laughed. "I'm taking half your millions, including your grandmother's estate." The courtroom erupted until I stood, handed the judge my envelope, and said, "Check again." The judge simply looked at my wife and burst out laughing. I still remember the weight of that envelope in my hands as I walked into the Charleston courthouse. It was surprisingly light, just a few sheets of paper, some official signatures, a notary seal, yet it carried the force of a sledgehammer. It was capable of shattering the illusions that had nearly destroyed my life. That single envelope transformed what should have been my financial ruin into the most decisive victory I would ever experience. A moment of justice so perfectly timed that it felt almost theatrical in its execution. But to understand how it came to that dramatic courtroom moment, how my wife stood there laughing as if she had already won, and how Judge Evelyn Hartwell's unexpected laughter sealed Victoria's complete downfall, you need to understand the long, painful road that led me to that precise instant when everything changed. My name is Alexander Grant. I am 48 years old, a financial consultant by profession, and a man who once foolishly believed that professional success and accumulated wealth would somehow insulate me from the kind of heartbreak that destroys ordinary people. I was wrong in ways I could never have imagined. When I was younger and more naive about human nature, Charleston, South Carolina, has been my world for as long as I can remember. I was born in this historic city, raised among its oak-lined streets and antebellum architecture, and carefully built my reputation here as someone who understood money and markets, the way experienced sailors understand tides and currents. My success wasn't handed to me through inheritance or family connections. It was forged through countless long nights, studying market trends, cultivating client relationships, and learning from the steady mentorship of my grandmother, Margaret Grant. She left me not just substantial wealth when she passed, but something far more valuable: the wisdom to protect what you build, and the foresight to anticipate betrayal before it destroys you. For years, I lived with careful discipline. I systematically built my consulting firm, meticulously maintained the family estate that had been in our family for generations, and deliberately avoided the traps that ruin successful men in my profession: unchecked greed, social vanity, reckless spending on depreciating assets. I had structure in my life, iron discipline in my habits, and clear boundaries in my business dealings. What I lacked, however, was the one thing that money cannot purchase: genuine human companionship, the warmth that comes from sharing your life with someone who values you for who you are rather than what you possess. That persistent loneliness created a vulnerability I didn't recognize until it was almost too late. And that's precisely when Victoria Prescott entered my carefully ordered world, like a summer storm, beautiful, exciting, and ultimately devastating. With her arrival came the kind of calculated deception you never fully see until the damage has already been done and the masks have finally fallen away to reveal the truth beneath. She studied me the way an art appraiser studies a valuable painting, measuring not my character, but my net worth, calculating not compatibility, but profit potential. I was her target long before I ever thought of her as my future. And by the time I understood what was happening, I had already signed the marriage certificate that she assumed would guarantee her fortune. Victoria Prescott was the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she entered any room, not merely because of her striking appearance, but because of the way she carried herself, with the effortless confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of being noticed. She worked as an art curator at one of Charleston's most prestigious galleries. She possessed the rare ability to discuss Renaissance paintings and modern installations with equal passion, speaking about artistic movements as though she had personally lived through each transformative period in history. I first encountered her at a charity gala, hosted in one of Charleston's historic downtown mansions. I had attended reluctantly, at the insistence of a longtime client, who believed I spent too much time buried in financial reports, and not enough time engaging with Charleston's social scene. I had fully intended to make a brief appearance, shake a few hands, write a check to whatever cause was being championed that evening, and return to the comfortable solitude of my study. But Victoria had other plans that I would not understand until much later. She approached me directly, bypassing the usual social rituals of subtle glances and arranged introductions that typically characterized these events. She asked about my work, with what seemed like genuine fascination, as though the intricate world of financial consulting and portfolio management held the same beauty and complexity as the abstract expressionist paintings hanging on the gallery walls behind us. She laughed easily at my cautious attempts at humor, listened attentively when I explained market strategies, and somehow made me feel as though I was the most interesting person in a room full of Charleston's elite. Looking back with the painful clarity that only hindsight and betrayal can provide, I recognize now that she was studying me with the calculating precision of an appraiser. Evaluating a valuable asset, she was measuring the scale of my fortune. Through careful questions about my family's history in Charleston, she was assessing the depth of my loneliness. Through observations about how rarely I attended social functions, she was gauging my vulnerability. Through the way I responded to her attention with the awkward gratitude of someone unused to being pursued. At the time, however, I interpreted her interest as something authentic. I allowed myself to believe that a woman of her sophistication and charm had genuinely fallen for a man whose primary skills involved spreadsheets and risk assessment models. We fell into what I can only describe as a calculated whirlwind, though I didn't recognize the calculation until it was far too late. Gallery openings, where she would hold my arm and introduce me to artists and collectors, as though I belonged in their world. Long drives along the South Carolina coast, where she spoke passionately about opening her own gallery someday, subtly planting seeds about needing capital and the right partner. Elaborate dinners at Charleston's finest restaurants, where she ordered wine with the kind of unshakable confidence that comes from either extensive knowledge or complete indifference to cost. For a man who had spent decades living by schedules, quarterly projections, and carefully maintained routines, her spontaneity felt intoxicating. She represented everything my disciplined life lacked: excitement, passion, the thrill of unpredictability. Within 8 months, we were married. In a picture-perfect ceremony in Savannah, we stood beneath blooming magnolia trees and strings of golden lights, while friends and family celebrated what they called a golden couple. She, the vibrant art curator, who brought culture and sophistication; me, the disciplined financier, who brought stability and security. What none of them knew, what I did not know until it was almost too late, was that Victoria had been playing a very different game. From the beginning, I was never her partner. I was always her target. 18 months into our marriage, the carefully balanced dynamics of our relationship shifted dramatically. My grandmother's estate passed fully into my control, following the completion of probate proceedings. The numbers were staggering, even to someone who spent every day analyzing financial portfolios, millions in meticulously managed trusts that had been growing for decades. The ancestral Grant family home, situated on 10 pristine acres outside Charleston's historic district, and extensive collections of museum-quality art and rare manuscripts that dated back more than a century of careful family curation. Victoria's reaction to this windfall was immediate, effusive, and in retrospect, revealing in ways I was too willingly blind to recognize at the time. She celebrated with champagne and elaborate plans, but her language choices carried a subtle emphasis that should have alarmed me. She spoke constantly about our home, our fortune, our growing empire, using plural pronouns that claimed joint ownership of assets that had existed in my family long before she entered my life. Initially, I allowed this linguistic appropriation without objection. I told myself that marriage meant partnership, and that her enthusiasm for our shared future was natural and even touching. But our financial records began telling a very different story, a story that contradicted the narrative of partnership. She projected so convincingly in social settings She commissioned expensive renovations to the family estate that I had never approved, transforming rooms that had remained unchanged for generations to suit her modern aesthetic preferences. She threw increasingly lavish parties for Charleston society, events that cost tens of thousands of dollars, and seemed designed more to establish her social standing than to maintain meaningful relationships. Most troubling of all, she began making what she called strategic investments in various ventures. An imported wine bar in downtown Charleston, a boutique art gallery that collapsed within 6 months, a catering business that never gained traction. Each failure was dismissed with practiced ease, explained away as simply part of the lifestyle we deserved, as though wealth existed to be spent recklessly, rather than protected and grown through careful stewardship. The whispers began circulating through Charleston's tight-knit social circles within months. I overheard Victoria at the country club, telling a group of impressed acquaintances that she had personally breathed new life into the dusty old Grant estate. She claimed she had transformed it from a relic into a showcase of contemporary elegance. Some of these people even congratulated me afterward for finding a wife who understood wealth and sophistication as deeply as I did. Their comments stung with unintended irony, but I knew better than to trust appearances and social performances. Numbers, unlike people, don't lie. They don't maintain elaborate facades, and Victoria's numbers were spiraling into dangerous territory, consuming capital at rates that would eventually threaten even substantial wealth if left unchecked. The final breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening. I discovered a series of encrypted emails hidden in a folder on our shared computer, labeled innocuously enough as renovation invoices. To avoid suspicion, inside that digital Pandora's box, I found months of correspondence between Victoria and a divorce attorney named Charles Morton. Their exchanges were brutally frank, in ways that shattered whatever remained of my illusions about our marriage. The subject lines told the entire story in clinical language. Strategy for divorce, maximizing settlement, grandmother's inheritance as marital asset, timeline for filing. They had been planning my financial destruction with the same attention to detail that I brought to my consulting work. They treated our marriage as nothing more than a transaction to be optimized for her benefit. I sat in my study until well past midnight, staring at those emails until the words blurred together. I felt the peculiar numbness that comes from having your worst suspicions confirmed in the most brutal way possible. The betrayal wasn't primarily about the financial scheming. I had encountered opportunists and con artists throughout my professional life. The deeper wound came from realizing that every smile, every touch, every whispered promise had been part of an elaborate performance, and I had been her willing audience. The Charleston family courthouse was packed. That humid morning in late September, the crowd seemed to sense they were about to witness something extraordinary unfold. Word had spread quickly through Charleston's interconnected social networks that the Grants, the couple who had seemed so perfectly matched, so enviably golden, were dissolving their marriage in what promised to be a spectacular battle over millions of dollars and generational wealth. Local reporters lined the courthouse steps with cameras and notebooks. Spectators who had managed to secure seats in the public gallery leaned forward with anticipation. They looked as though they were about to watch a sporting event or a theatrical performance. Victoria entered the courtroom as though she were walking a red carpet, radiant in an expensive tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Her expression combined confidence and barely suppressed triumph. She thrived in moments of public attention, and here she had an audience, primed to witness what she clearly believed would be her greatest performance. Her attorney, Charles Morton, stood beside her projecting similar confidence. Within minutes of the proceedings beginning, he declared before Judge Evelyn Hartwell that his client was entitled to half of my entire fortune, specifically including the millions I had inherited from my grandmother's carefully managed estate. The courtroom buzzed with shocked murmurs and excited whispers as people absorbed the audacity of the claim. Spectators exchanged knowing glances, already composing the dramatic headline in their minds. Socialite art curator wins millions in high-profile Charleston divorce. Some were thrilled by the spectacle. Others seemed genuinely sympathetic to what they assumed would be my devastating financial loss. But all were captivated by the unfolding drama. I remained completely still. Throughout Morton's dramatic presentation, I maintained the calm, focused demeanor that had served me well through decades of high-stakes financial negotiations. My attorney, Eleanor Blake, sat beside me, radiating the kind of quiet, unshakable confidence that comes only from meticulous preparation and absolute certainty in the strength of your position. She had spent weeks reviewing every document, anticipating every argument, preparing for this exact moment, with the thoroughness that had made her one of Charleston's most respected family law attorneys. When Judge Hartwell finally called for my response, I rose slowly from my seat. I felt the weight of every eye in that packed courtroom, following my movement. The envelope I had carried with me that morning felt almost weightless in my hands, despite the enormous power contained within those few sheets of carefully drafted legal language. I walked to the judge's bench with measured steps, placed the envelope before her with steady hands, and returned to my seat, without theatrics or unnecessary commentary. The silence that descended over the courtroom was so profound, you could have heard a pin drop on the polished marble floor. Judge Hartwell opened the envelope with practiced efficiency, her experienced eyes scanning the pages, with the kind of focused attention that comes from years of adjudicating complex family disputes. I watched her expression shift subtly, first tightening with concentration as she absorbed the legal language, then softening almost imperceptibly as she recognized the implications, and finally curving into the faintest trace of what could only be described as professional amusement at the spectacular miscalculation unfolding before her. The prenuptial agreement Victoria had signed so casually years earlier was all there. Every clause and subsection meticulously documented, all premarital assets fully protected, all inheritance explicitly untouchable, regardless of when received. No provision for spousal support, no shared responsibility for debts incurred individually. Ironclad language, drafted by Eleanor herself, back when I had still been naive enough to hope I would never need it. The spectators sensed the dramatic shift before it was officially announced. They leaned even closer, with the collective instinct of people who know they are witnessing a reversal of fortune. Victoria's confident posture faltered as she watched the judge's reaction. Morton stammered something barely audible, clearly realizing his catastrophic oversight. And then Judge Hartwell did something I will never forget. She laughed. The judge's laughter wasn't cruel or mocking. It carried the tone of genuine disbelief, the sound of arrogance colliding spectacularly with reality. It echoed through the packed courtroom, creating a ripple effect as spectators realized they were witnessing not Victoria's triumph, but her complete and utter downfall. Judge Hartwell composed herself quickly, returning to professional demeanor. She delivered her ruling with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for appeal or misunderstanding. The prenuptial agreement was valid, comprehensive, and absolutely binding. Victoria would receive nothing from my premarital assets, nothing from my grandmother's estate, and no ongoing spousal support of any kind. More devastating still, she would bear the full financial burden of the substantial debts she had accumulated during our marriage. The failed wine bar venture, the collapsed gallery, the unpaid country club dues, and the maxed-out credit cards that had funded her increasingly lavish lifestyle. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the full scope of the ruling sank in. Some spectators covered their mouths to stifle inappropriate laughter. Others whispered furiously to companions. A few looked genuinely shocked by the dramatic reversal they had just witnessed. Victoria, who had entered that morning as Charleston society's darling poised to claim millions, now sat frozen. Her expression cycled rapidly between disbelief, humiliation, and dawning horror as she calculated what this judgment actually meant for her future. She left the courthouse that day through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras that had captured her confident arrival only hours earlier. Her empire of carefully constructed illusions collapsed around her with the same speed it had been built. In the months that followed, her decline was as rapid and public as her ascent had been. Creditors pursued her relentlessly for debts she could no longer pay. Her reputation in Charleston, once polished to gleaming perfection, through charm and strategic social positioning, became stained by whispers of greed, manipulation, and spectacular miscalculation. By year's end, Victoria had quietly left Charleston altogether. She relocated to some distant city, where her name didn't carry the weight of scandal, and her story hadn't become a cautionary tale, told at country clubs and charity galas. Her departure felt less like a victory for me, and more like the natural conclusion of a narrative she had written herself, through years of calculated deception. As for me, I remained exactly where I had always been, in Charleston, in the family home that had weathered far worse storms than one failed marriage. I was surrounded by the legacy my grandmother had worked so hard to protect. The estate stayed intact, but more importantly, the peace of mind I had lost during those years of manipulation slowly returned as I rebuilt my life on foundations that could not be shaken by superficial charm or social performance. I used a portion of my inheritance to establish the Grant Foundation. I dedicated it to financial literacy education and legal protection resources for people entering marriages or business partnerships. The foundation provides consultations with experienced attorneys, educational workshops about prenuptial agreements, and support for those who discover too late that they've been targeted for their assets rather than loved for their character. If my painful experience could prevent even one person from enduring similar betrayal, the scars would carry meaning. Looking back now, I see Victoria not as the great love story of my life, but as the sharp, necessary lesson I needed to learn. The lesson about the difference between genuine partnership and calculated performance. Wealth can be rebuilt through discipline and smart decisions. Homes can be repaired with time and resources. But trust, once shattered by deliberate deception, becomes a permanent map of scars that changes how you navigate every relationship that follows. Victoria tried to take half my fortune and claim my grandmother's legacy as her prize. In the end, she gave me something far more valuable than she could ever have stolen: the clarity to recognize that some prices are too high to pay for companionship, and that some people reveal more about themselves through their greed than they ever could through their charm. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Every voice has value,